Last time we considered the exchange of gases across the alveolar surfaces. So now let's consider some of the things that drive that exchange. And let's look first at the external things, so the air. So the air that we breathe is comprised of several different types of gases, two of which are very prominent. We've got diatomic nitrogen, which accounts for about 78% of the component of air, and about 21% is oxygen. The rest is carbon dioxide, water vapor, and other gases. So if we were to take some of this gas and measure it at sea level, typically on a standard day, what we call a standard day, at 1 atmosphere, we would find that that gas, if we basically had a cup of mercury with a capillary tube in it, and then we measured the height of the mercury in the capillary tube, it would be about 760 millimeters. So we say that the pressure of the air on a standard day at 1 atmosphere, that is at sea level, is about 760 millimeters of mercury. And this will vary from day to day with pressure fronts and high and low pressures and weather and so forth. But the standard is 760, which equates to about 14.7 pounds of pressure per square inch. So this is the pressure that the air is exerting on things that are at sea level. So when we're standing here, the air is exerting that much pressure on us. So if we were to take some of this air and put it in a container, then it would exert pressure against the walls of that container. Now, if we were to squeeze that container down to half its size, so half its volume, the pressure in the air would double. If we were to take that container and give it twice its volume, then the pressure would drop by half, assuming that it is a contained system and no air can leave or come in. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is what contributes to this pressure within this container. So the pressures in this container are going to be basically the partial pressures of the individual gases that make up that air. So for our situation, just regular air in the atmosphere, it's about 78% nitrogen. So nitrogen would contribute about 78% of the pressure in that container. By the same token, oxygen would contribute about 21% of the pressure in that gas that it's exerting on that container, on the walls of that container. And carbon dioxide, very little. But what we will come to find out is that in any contained system, the pressures exerted by a mixture of gas is going to be dependent upon the individual gases that make it up and the percentage of each of their concentrations. So one of the things that we will see that drives exchanges, especially when we have aqueous solutions of gases, is the partial pressures of the gases in solution. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that gases have different solubilities in solution. But we can force gases into solution by increasing the pressure. So if we have a contained system and we have some gas and we press that container, we will drive some of those gases, those gas molecules, into solution. So the higher the pressure we have, then the more gas gets dissolved into the solution. And so we can see a good example of forcing gas into solution when we look at soda drinks or any carbonated beverage, because what they did there to get the fizziness of the carbonated beverage is they took some liquid and then they put carbon dioxide in it, and then they put it in a closed system or a closed container, and then they increased the pressure, and then they forced the carbon dioxide to dissolve into the liquid. And so as soon as you pop the cap on a soda can, then immediately the pressure is going to be relieved, so a lot of that gas will be dissolving out of the solution. And this is what gives it its fizziness. But after about half an hour, all the gas is dissolved out of the solution, and now we're back to equilibrium. So typically, if you just leave water or some solution sitting out on the table, you'll have as much gas being dissolved as being released at the same time. But once you put the gas under pressure, then more of it will be forced to be dissolved into that solution. So once you pop the top off the soda can and you leave it sitting there for a while, then it will reach an equilibrium. So it tastes flat because it has doesn't have any more carbon dioxide than just any liquid sitting around at 1 atmosphere. So in other words, if you were to pop the top, now you'll reach equilibrium because all the gas that was dissolved in there under pressure will be released. And now you'll have some gas being dissolved, but you'll have the exact same amount of gas being released from the solution. So there's no net change. So under pressure, we can change the amount of gas that's going to be dissolved into that solution. And then as soon as we relieve the pressure, then of course it'll go back to equilibrium that it would be at at 1 atmosphere. All right, so the gas laws pertain exactly to this. So we've talked about some of the gas laws by one of our earlier chemists, Boyle. I forget his first name right now, but we'd studied some of those. Now we can look at one of the laws that John Dalton proposed, and he was a chemist, meteorologist of the 1766 to 1844, I think. But at any rate, as we said, nitrogen comprises most of the air, so it's going to exert most of the pressure. And oxygen's about 21%, just under 21%. Carbon dioxide and water vapor make up most of the rest. And what he proposed was that the partial pressures, that is the percentages of these gases, is going to determine how much pressure that they're going to exert in a closed system. Now, as we've said, our atmospheric pressure is about 760 millimeters of mercury. So each gas is going to contribute to the total pressure in proportion to how much is present in the mixture. So when we add up all the pressures of these things, we get 760 millimeters of mercury. If we wanted to know about how much pressure the oxygen alone is contributing, we'd take 21% of 760. If we want to know how much pressure nitrogen is contributing to the atmospheric pressure, we would take 78% or almost 79% of 760 millimeters of mercury. All right, so then we can go on to Henry's law. Once again, I've forgotten Henry's first name, but at any rate, he showed that gas, when it's under pressure and comes in contact with liquid, it will basically be dissolved in that liquid until an equilibrium is reached, until you get as much release of the gas as you have that's being dissolved. And we find that under higher pressures, much more gas will be dissolved in the liquid. And then at lower pressures, a lot of that will be released until once again this equilibrium is released. And we also find that the amount of gas in the solution is going to be proportional to the partial pressure at of that gas, but that's going to change at different temperatures. Because as we've seen before with the gas laws, volume has an effect, but temperature is also going to have effect because temperature and volume are also related. So if we had a gas that was unconstrained and we heated it up, it would expand, obviously, because it's going to have more energy. And so the particles are going to bump around each other more. You're going to have more of this random motion and more collisions, and that's going to force these particles apart. Now, if you cool the gas down, then it's going to contract because it's not experiencing as many of those collisions. There's not as much energy. And as we know, temperature and volume are going to be proportionally related. So as we increase the temperature, we're going to increase the volume and vice versa. And we will also see that if we put this in a constrained system, and now we heat the gas and it's in a closed system or in a container where it can't escape and none can enter in, then if we heat this gas, it's going to have more pressure because it's going to try to expand a higher volume and it can't. So it's going therefore to increase its pressure. So basically, Dalton's laws and Henry's laws combined will basically give you a way to predict how much gas is going to be in solution at a given partial pressure and a given temperature. And a lot of that's going to depend on the solubility of that gas in the particular liquid. And for our cases, we're going to be considering mainly water because this is the main composition of blood plasma. And we will find that oxygen and carbon dioxide actually have different solubilities. But here's an example. Here we put our soda in our can, and once we increase our pressure, then we force more molecules into the into the solution until we've reached equilibrium. So now there are as many molecules in solution as there are out of solution. And then when we release the pressure, then we're going to have diffusion out of solution, so that now the dissolved gas will obviously have much more space out here to occupy, and so it will dissolve out of the solution and up into the atmosphere, just like our soda pop can that we opened earlier and left open, and now it's flat. All right, so one of the things we find is carbon dioxide is quite soluble in the body, and this is going to be important, especially we consider how carbon dioxide and oxygen are carried around in the body. So carbon dioxide is going to be very soluble. Oxygen will be much less soluble, and we'll see that it doesn't dissolve well in plasma. So if we had to rely on blood plasma alone to carry oxygen, we would be in a bad way. That's why we have red blood cells with hemoglobin, this specialized molecule to carry around oxygen. We will find that because carbon dioxide is soluble, it tends to form with water or combine with water to form carbonic acid, and then that will be broken down into bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. And we will see that most of the carbon dioxide that is transported around in blood is transported as carbonic or bicarbonate ion. And we'll see that process in a lot of detail a little bit later on. We will find that nitrogen does not have a high solubility. It has a very low solubility. And this is why when we have rapid pressure changes and someone has been breathing compressed gases, they will tend to get the bends, because if we forced this nitrogen into solution under high pressures, then suddenly we release the pressure, then the nitrogen will bubble out of solution. And guess what? It ends up in the joints. It ends up in all kinds of places and causes excruciating pain. In the cerebrospinal fluid, it ends up all over the place, bubbling out, and it doesn't have a way to get out. And so we can't off-gas it fast enough. So it ends up just staying in solutions in the body. And this is why divers, when they come up too quickly from depths at very, very high pressures, and they've breathed this compressed air and filled their lungs entirely. We talked last time about the fact that at about 10 meters underwater, the volume in your lungs halves if you're just carrying your own oxygen from the surface. But if you're breathing compressed air, well, now you're occupying your full volume of lungs. And if you are now breathing nitrogen in there, now you come up very quickly, and you can't off-gas that quickly enough, that it's going to end up in body fluids, and it's going to start to bubble out of those body fluids in places like joint capsules. So this is why nitrogen can cause the bends or decompression sickness in divers. All right, so if we look at the partial pressures within pulmonary vein plasma, we find that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is about 40 millimeters of mercury. Oxygen is about 100 millimeters of mercury, and this is after it's been oxygenated, mind you, and because this is in the pulmonary veins, so it's going to have come from the lungs, and it's going to be returning to the heart from the lungs. And so this is going to be our oxygenated blood. And our partial pressure of nitrogen is 573 millimeters of mercury, but it's not very soluble. So this is going to be somewhat negligible when we look at our calculations. All right, so when we're going to focus mostly, obviously, on carbon dioxide and oxygen. So when we look at respiratory function, we're going to look at how these different gases diffuse across the respiratory membrane, and that is going to be determined by their partial pressures and their solubilities. All right, so one of the reasons we have efficiency of gas exchange is we have a very, very, very small distance. So as you know, the epithelial surface, those simple squamous cells of the alveoli, have their basement membrane fused with the endothelial cells of the adjacent blood vessels, of the capillaries that are going to be picking up and distributing this gas. So basically, the gas exchange distance is going to be very short, and these gases are lipid soluble. This is another important point. So both of them are lipid soluble, so they can get across the membrane very quickly. Now, the surface area within the lungs is quite large. If we were to lay it out flat, it would be about 35 times the surface area of our bodies, of our skin. And if you were to lay it out flat, it would cover approximately half a tennis court. So that's quite a bit of volume. We also have one other important thing. The blood flow and the airflow are coordinated. So we are not going to bring we're going to bring a lot of blood to the capillaries where there's rich oxygen, because we want to pick up that oxygen and take it to the lungs. We don't want to go pick up air that's mostly carbon dioxide. And so that way we're going to be able to pick up the oxygen because we've shunted our blood flow around the alveoli that are rich in oxygen so that blood can pick it up. And by the same token, then once we have off-gassed the carbon dioxide, when we breathe out, where other alveoli or maybe have mostly carbon dioxide in them, then once they've breathed the carbon dioxide out and now oxygen is coming in, now that blood flow, capillary blood flow, will be shunted towards those alveoli now, the ones that have the oxygen-rich air. All right, so basically the blood arriving in the pulmonary arteries, remember this is coming from the heart to the lungs. We're going to have a low oxygen concentration because this is the blood that had just returned from the systemic circuit and has just been, all the oxygen's been taken out of it, or a lot of the oxygen has been taken out of it to drive cellular processes. And it's going to bear the carbon dioxide burden of those processes. So in other words, internal respiration, cellular respiration has produced carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is then put into the blood, which is then taken to the heart and is now taken to the lungs for reoxygenation. So basically, we have concentration gradients, and the concentration gradients obviously are caused by these partial pressures. So it's going to cause oxygen from the lungs to enter into the blood and the carbon dioxide in the blood to leave and get into the air in the alveolus. So this basically, rapid exchange allows blood and alveolar air to reach equilibrium, and this takes place in like 0.3 of a second. This is very rapid exchange. All right, so one of the things we have to be aware of is the fact that during this transit, some of the oxygenated blood is going to be mixing with deoxygenated blood that came from the conducting passageways. So we've got some of the conducting passageways, the deoxygenated blood that's perfusing these things is going to be mixing with the oxygenated blood. So this is actually going to lower our partial pressure of oxygen of the blood entering the systemic circuit. So it's going to drop a little bit. But nevertheless, it's still going to be much, much higher than what we see in the cells. So the peripheral cells, the tissues are still going to have much lower oxygen. So it's still going to provide a gradient that's going to be strongly sufficient to move that oxygen into the cells. All right, so interstitial fluids have about 40 millimeters of mercury of oxygen and about 45 of carbon dioxide. So basically, remember we had 40 of carbon dioxide. It was back here somewhere. Well, we'll see it later, and it's in the book. But at any rate, we're going to have about 40 carbon dioxide in the oxygenated blood and 45 at the tissues. So basically, the concentration gradient and the peripheral capillaries is going to be quite opposite from what we have in the lungs. So in the lungs, we're going to have high oxygen, low carbon dioxide. So oxygen is going to go into the blood, and carbon dioxide from the blood is going to go into the alveoli. Now, when we look at the peripheral capillaries where we're perfusing the tissues, the oxygen is going to be low in the tissues because they're using it. And so oxygen is going to go from the blood into the tissues, and their tissues are producing carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is going to come from the blood, from the tissues into the blood. So basically, this is what we see. So here we have our external respiration first. We're going to have our pulmonary circuit bring the deoxygenated blood to the alveolus. So here we'll have the blood that will be coming from the pulmonary arteries into these arterioles and capillaries. And then once we've got that, then we can exchange our oxygen, which is going to be about a partial pressure of 100 within the alveolus, and within the blood, it's going to be about 40. Notice our carbon dioxide here is at 45. It's going to go out because this has a partial pressure of about 40 within the alveolus. And then we're going to have our reoxygenated blood, and we've dumped a lot of our carbon dioxide here. So as we go back to our pulmonary veins and return this to the lungs for redistribution in the peripheral circuit, we'll have about a partial pressure of 95, because as we know, as it exits, it's going to intermingle with some of the blood that is perfusing the conducting passageway, so that lowers the partial pressure of oxygen a little bit. And then we're going to have our carbon dioxide still at 40, which is going to be lower than in the tissues. So when we come to the tissues now, we go into the systemic circuit now, and we will see that our oxygen, our partial pressure of oxygen, is 95 within the plasma. As it approaches the tissue, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40. So our oxygen is going to diffuse into the tissues, which have a partial pressure of oxygen of about 40. And notice we have a partial pressure of about 45 of carbon dioxide, and that's going then to leave to its lower concentration here of 40. So in a way, we consider our partial pressures to be very much like concentration gradients. All right, so as we know that blood plasma itself can't really transport oxygen or carbon dioxide very well. So this is why we have red blood cells. Red blood cells are extremely important for transporting oxygen via hemoglobin, and they're also very important in the enzymatic process to convert carbon dioxide and water into carbonic acid, which will then break down into bicarbonate ion, which will then be dissolved in plasma. And so we will find that the majority of our carbon dioxide will be transported as bicarbonate ion. And then the hydrogen will be buffered until the trip to the lungs, where this stuff is recombined. We get our carbon dioxide and water back, and then we can off-gas our carbon dioxide. We will see that about 7% of carbon dioxide is actually able to be transported as carbon dioxide gas dissolved in plasma. So not very much. And we will see most of it is going to be transported as this bicarbonate ion, and the rest will be transported by hanging on to one of the amino terminuses of the hemoglobin protein. So we will end up having something called carbaminohemoglobin, and we'll talk about all of these in just a little bit. So basically, we're going to have oxygen bind to the iron ions that are in the middle of that hemoglobin molecule. And you remember we have 4 subunits. Each subunit has a heme molecule in it, and the heme is an inorganic molecule that's holding an iron ion in place. And of course, iron has a high affinity for oxygen, so oxygen will bind that iron ion. And it's a reversible oxygen. And while oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, it's called oxyhemoglobin. And so if each red blood cells has about 280 million hemoglobin molecules, and each one can bind 4 oxygens, then you can see we have quite a capacity to carry oxygen via these hemoglobin and red blood cells. Now, hemoglobin rarely ever gets saturated. So what we consider the percentage of hemoglobin heme molecules bound with oxygen would be its saturation. And we'll notice that the saturation of the hemoglobin is going to change depending on quite a few number of factors. The main one, obviously, is the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. And we will see that as the partial pressure of oxygen gets higher, we will have a very steep rise in the affinity for oxygen. And we'll see why that is. That goes into the idea of a principle of allosteric cooperation, which is not in your book, but we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail when we talk about hemoglobin. We will see that the pH of blood is also going to change the affinity of the hemoglobin molecule for oxygen. So it will actually lower the affinity. So as the pH lowers, then the affinity for oxygen will become lower. And this is important because imagine where the pH is going to get lower. It's going to be lower where the tissues are conducting high volumes of processes. So they're going to be producing carbon dioxide, creating carbonic acid, lactic acid. So our pH will lower where there's acid, and so that will be where we're having a lot of tissue metabolism. And so we're going to need more oxygen, obviously, to perfuse those tissues that are doing high rates of metabolism. Temperature will also change the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen and metabolic activity within the red blood cells themselves. All right, so we have something called an oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve. And this is going to tell us how much oxygen is bound to this hemoglobin related to the partial pressure of oxygen. So if you had all of your hemoglobin molecules completely bound with oxygen, that would be 100% saturation. If none of them were bound with oxygen, that would be a 0% saturation. And the reason the curve is straight, or not straight, it's a curve, and it's a sigmoid curve, and it's sort of goes into this very steep curve, and then it levels off as we get close to 100%, and as the partial pressures increase. So what we will see is that we don't just have a one-to-one, okay, when oxygen binds, as the partial pressure increases, then more hemoglobin is going to be bound. We're actually going to have a change in the protein, so that one of these hemoglobin subunits binds an oxygen. That's going to make it easier for the next one. And then that's going to make it easier for the next one and the next one, because the proteins are actually changing shape. And that's allowing the binding sites, which are sort of half obscured, let's say, half covered. Once one oxygen binds, it's going to be much easier for the second. And once the second binds, it's going to be easier still for the third and the fourth. And this is what we call allosteric cooperation. And allostery is this idea of changing of binding affinity of a protein by changing its shape. So a lot of times proteins can change shape because of something else binding to it. So if we have one oxygen binding a subunit of hemoglobin, then it's going to be easier for the second one to bind, and so forth. So what this is going to allow is that when the oxygen levels are low and one oxygen binds, well, that's going to make it much easier for the other oxygens to bind, and then we can quickly saturate our curve. So here is the oxyhemoglobin saturation with the concentration, the partial pressure of oxygen. And we see at very low partial pressures, we don't have much binding, but as soon as we reach about 20% partial pressure, we have this really steep increase. And by the time we reach about 60% partial pressure, we've already saturated about 90% of our hemoglobin molecules. So we will find that we're going to have a reserve, so that as we off-gas carbon dioxide and our tissues are using oxygen, and there's going to be, even in venous blood, there's going to be a fair amount of oxygen that's going to be carried by the hemoglobin, even at low partial pressure. So you can imagine if you're doing intense physical activity and your partial pressures drop to, say, 20 millimeters of mercury. We saw that in most interstitial tissues, it's around 40% or 40 millimeters of mercury. If you get down to 20 millimeters of mercury, you still have a saturation under normal conditions of around 30%. So this means that you have some reserve in venous blood. So if suddenly you hold your breath or you have deprivation of oxygen for some reason, you still have some oxygen that's bound to hemoglobin. All right, so we have a couple of things. For example, pH. We've talked about pH. And I think Niels Bohr's son, or maybe it was his father, Niels Bohr, who discovered the hydrogen, or who came up with the hydrogen atom, or the hydrogen model of the atom, his father was a physician, and his father found out that the pH is going to change the hemoglobin saturation curve. It's going to change the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. And there again, this makes sense, because proteins are going to change shape as we change our pH. And we know if we change the pH too much and we denature the protein so that it unravels, it no longer works. But we will find that as the pH decreases, that the affinity for oxygen of the hemoglobin molecule will decrease. And this is going to be important, because if you're transporting oxygen around in hemoglobin and blood, and all of a sudden you get to an area where there's a lot of metabolic activity of tissues and they've driven the pH down, well, these tissues are going to need more oxygen because they're consuming a lot of oxygen and producing a lot of carbon dioxide. So at physiological pH, you remember blood plasma is usually around 7.35 to 7.45, and anything outside of that starts to get to acidosis or alkalosis. When we get down to about 7.2, notice that we're letting go of our oxygen much sooner, so that by the time we reach, say, 60, or I should say, 60 partial pressure of oxygen, we're only going to be about 80% saturated, where at normal physiologic pH will be more like 90 or closer to 90%. So you can see that we're shortening the curve. So we're shifting it with the pH changes. With the lowering of pH, we are shifting the curve over to the right, and as we raise the pH, we shift it to the left so that we have more oxygenation with higher pH and less oxygenation with lower pH, because the low pH is going to be around tissues that need more perfusion. So that makes sense. All right, now temperature is another thing that's going to affect our curves. So another thing is when the temperature decreases, hemoglobin is going to hold on to oxygen more tightly. Here again, when the temperature increases, that makes sense because we're going to once again start to unravel those proteins with temperature, and so the shape's going to change a little bit. It's going to lose some of its affinity for oxygen. So what does that mean? It means that now if we've got areas where there's higher temperature, that means those tissues are working. So once again, they're carrying on a lot of metabolic activity. So they're going to need more oxygen. So it's nice if we have hemoglobin that's going to give up its oxygen more readily when it reaches these tissues, right? All right, so here is our saturation curves here is our normal temperature, body temperature around 37, 38 degrees centigrade. As we get less and less temperature, if we get down to 10 degrees centigrade, we're in trouble. But as we get to, say, 43 degrees centigrade, then the hemoglobin is going to be much more likely to give up its oxygen. So now let's talk about carbon dioxide transport. So this is going to be one of the big things. This is our byproduct of aerobic metabolism. And so what we got is we've got three ways we can carry it. Number one is we're going to convert it to carbonic acid, which will then dissociate into bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. Hydrogen ion will usually be buffered by the red blood cells. Or we can have it bound directly to hemoglobin within the red blood cell, but not at the heme group, at the amino terminus. So it's going to create a compound called carbaminohemoglobin, or it can be dissolved in plasma, and this is about 7%, so not that much. All right, so what's going to happen, and it's really about 70% is going to be transported as carbonic acid or bicarbonate ion. So let's look at the picture. It's much easier to look at the picture. So there's a very nice picture in your book. This is it right here. And this is going to show sort of the pathways that we have. So when we pick up oxygen at the alveolus, so oxygen is going to come in, it's going to bind hemoglobin, it's going to create a compound called oxyhemoglobin. And then that blood will reach the peripheral tissues, and now we're going to have a higher partial pressure of oxygen, about 95 within the blood, as opposed to about 40 within the tissues. So obviously oxygen is going to go down its concentration gradient, or its partial pressure gradient in this case, to the tissues. Now, the carbon dioxide in the tissues is going to be about 45% or 45 millimeters of mercury partial pressure, as compared to about 40 in the blood. So what's going to happen is we're going to have our three pathways. Some of that carbon dioxide, about 7%, will be dissolved directly by the plasma. The other of which will enter into the red blood cell. About 23% will bind to our amino termini of our hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin. The rest of it will be converted by something called carbonic anhydrase. and it will be converted, carbon dioxide will be converted with the, I should say, the catalyzed the reaction water with carbon dioxide to form carbonic acid. Now here's our carbonic acid, and it will immediately dissociate into bicarbonate ion. Bicarbonate ion typically does not stick around in the red blood cell. What it does is it gets transported out to the plasma. And there is a transporter that does this. And this transporter will basically exchange one bicarbonate ion for one chloride ion. So it's an ionic exchange transporter. And so we have a shift of chlorine from outside into, I should say chloride ion, into the red blood cell, and bicarbonate outside. We call this the chloride shift. Now, as we approach the lungs, what's going to happen is the bicarbonate ion will be brought back into the red blood cell. The chloride ion will be pushed out or transported out. And then we will have our hemoglobin, which was buffering our hydrogen. Remember, hemoglobin is a protein, and it can also act as a protein buffer. So it's holding on to our hydrogen, our excess hydrogen that was created when the carbonic acid broke apart and basically became carbonic acid or bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. So now that hydrogen was being held on to by some of the hemoglobin, and now it's going to release that hydrogen ion back so that it can then recombine with the bicarbonate ion that was brought back into the blood cell from the plasma. And then we're going to have the reconstitution of carbon dioxide and water. So basically we're going to have our carbon dioxide and water, and we're going to have the release of any carbaminohemoglobin is going to release its carbon dioxide as well, and whatever was dissolved in plasma will also then be off-gassed and basically go into the alveolar space.